No. Hello, everyone. Today is February 15th, 2022. We're here today for the Maryland Public Service Commission PC54, which is the Montgomery County Community Choice Energy Pilot Program Work Group. Let's see. If you'll go ahead and just go ahead and type your name and who you're with into the chat box. That would be the best way of taking roll for today. We're going to start off with a presentation from a group of suppliers, and then we're going to move on to the straw man, the revised straw man that was circulated by staff. Let's see, Ms. Gibbons, do you want to present, or would you like for me to share your slide deck?
Totally up to you, Judge. I'm happy to do that. I guess I will. Let me see if I can see how to do that on here. Don't know that oh, let me see here. And it doesn't seem to be letting me share, so you might have to.
So I'll go ahead and do that. It's
okay.
only opening in my browser, so we're going to get that view of it.
Okay.
Give me just 1 second.
No problem.
Getting rid of boxes. Can you see the your slide deck?
I can.
Okay, great.
Okay. Well, great. Well, first, I'll just say thanks very much for giving us the opportunity to talk to the group today. I think as we've been listening to the conversation over the last several weeks, it sort of seemed to us like it might be a great opportunity to sort of level set with everyone and sort of explain what we know. I mean, there are several suppliers in our group, including NRG and Vistra and IGS and Constellation. And amongst our companies, we're all very active in participating in serving community choice aggregations or municipal aggregations around the country. And so really what we wanted to do is sort of share our knowledge and experience with the group. Sort of little bit of foundation building is maybe a way to think of it, and just kind of explain sort of what are the different models out there, what are the differences. There's not really that many. There's really kind of two big models. And so we just kind of thought it would be useful to walk through those with the group a little bit. I know the county has been, really has a desire to be flexible and, go down whatever path that they're able to go down through the legislation. And, that's really great. I think from our perspective, our goal really is to help inform that the decisions that the county is going to make. And so we're really hopeful that this is helpful to you. So I'm not actually going to do the bulk of the talking here. I'm going to hand it over to my teammate, Mark Fanning from Vistra, and he's going to walk you through it. And Mark, I won't try to butcher your intro, so I'll just let you intro yourself and do yourself justice on what you do, because you actually do run a business function, and I think that's really important for everybody to know, because you're really in it in the day-to-day sense. So I think I'll hand it over to Mark, and from my perspective, I think we're happy to have this be as interactive as possible. So if people have questions as we go, I think I think it would be great if people just raise their hand or stopped and ask the questions. Hopefully, Mark, I assume you agree with that. And that'll have a good dialogue for us. So with that, unless there's any preliminary questions that anybody has, I'm going to hand it over to Mark. Okay, great. Mark, you're on mute.
That will be helpful for me to not be on mute.
There you go.
Thank you. And Judge Grace, if you don't mind, if you would just advance to the next slide, we can start there. As Leah said, I'm Mark Fanning, and I lead the CCA, or Municipal Aggregation Activity, for Vistra Corp. Our brand, people don't think of Vistra very much because they think more of the retail brands that we operate. So just for your benefit, our brands are Homefield Energy in Southern Illinois, and then Dynegy in all other markets. And as Lee said, representatives from NRG, Direct Energy, Constellation, IGS, and WL have also contributed to this presentation. The point I would make is that collectively, this group of suppliers serves the majority of CCAs across all competitive markets. So we have a lot of knowledge going back, in my case, all the way to 2012 with the introduction of CCAs in the state of Illinois. On this map, what you'll see are the highlighted states that have most of the active programs, CCA programs. Certainly, there are other states that have enabling legislation and rules in place, but they have not yet launched CCAs in those jurisdictions. And I believe, Judge Grace, you circulated a NARIC document that showed a number of other states that are in various stages looking to potentially investigate the implementation of CCAs. From my perspective, the most mature CCA models in the eastern United States are in Illinois, Ohio, and in Massachusetts. California, I would say, was very active about 5 years ago in launching CCAs, but the momentum in California has slowed due to some challenges we'll address later in the presentation. Judge, you can advance the slide, please. And Lee, as Lee pointed out early on, there's basically two prevailing CCA models, and the key differences are who serves as the load serving entity in these models. California is really distinct from all the other states with active CCA programs in that the CCAs in California, they serve as the load serving entity. What that means, and we'll get into that on the next slide in a little bit more detail, is that the LSE is really responsible for all operational and financial risks associated with running the programs. That's unique to California. In all the other states, retail suppliers serve as the LSE and manage all the operational and financial risks. I did a quick search this morning just to see what the current numbers are across the country, and there are less than 10 active CCAs in California, and there are approximately 700 active CCAs in other states, with a pipeline of more CCAs looking for approvals from their various legislative jurisdictions. To give you some perspective on the size of a CCA, they range from serving as few as 50 residential and small commercial customers, while other CCAs serve over 100,000 residential and small commercial customers. So each brings a different mindset to what they're trying to achieve through their CCA program, and certainly that leads to different levels of complexity as well. Next slide, please. This, I think, really gets to the guts of the matter around the key differences between being an LSE and not being an LSE. And if we just think in terms of requirements for an entity in Maryland to be an LSE, primarily, it all starts with being a member of the PJM interconnect. That is a fairly long process to become a member. Credit applications required, And generally speaking, an LSE who does not own generation resources to net against their collateral requirements on the load side would be posting collateral to be a LSE in the PJM interconnect. Obviously, to be a member, there's lots of agreements you have to sign that basically obligate you to do certain things. And one of the things that people don't think about often is that one of the things that obligates you to pay a share of any member defaults in PJM, which is doesn't happen often, but has happened in the past, where everybody who is a member gets an uplift of that supplier default. Some of the day-to-day things that an LSE has to do is they have to be responsible for supplying energy and procuring their loads, and that involves just a few of these items here. Load forecasting, which is done on an hourly basis, and you have to do that on a day-ahead basis. Typically, LSEs have statistical and weather models that help them develop what their hourly load forecasts are that they have to submit to PJM. They have to participate in the day ahead and real-time markets, meaning what they schedule in day ahead, if there's any variance from that, gets settled in the real-time markets. Typically, that's something that a supplier handles and provides as part of their contracting with an individual customer. So that's an item that is required, though, when you're an LSE. LSEs participate in capacity markets, and they get allocated their share of capacity required basically by each of the utilities, who develop a load forecast based on PJM rules that say for each individual residential or small commercial or large commercial account, this is what your this is what your PLC will be for a given year, which generally runs from June through May. Ancillary markets are basically all the other things that are required to provide reliability to the system. So those are products that you have to purchase and pay for. Transmission is one of those as well. So you would have to sign you would have to have a network integration transmission service agreement and reservation with PJM for you to be the LSE. And then there are other things like ARRs, auction revenue rights, which can be converted to financial transmission rights. Those are products in the market that are provided to hedge congestion costs. So the basis difference from where generation is to where your load is. That's usually something that's done, that's very specialized and done on various trade floors. And then once all of that's done, you're going to get settlements on a daily basis and be required to provide reconcile the usage data that accrues to you as an LSE, and be sure you pay PJM within 3 business days for all of your activity. There's also demand response activities that happen when you're an LSE, because there are curtailment service providers who can go and sign up customers, and then they basically can tell them when to curtail to help them manage their peak loads to try and clip either their capacity obligations or their transmission obligations, depending on the state. So that's down to what we call utility requirements. It is basically the activities an LSE has to undertake with PJM. On top of that, then there's the utility requirements. Typically, an LSE who's going to be a retail supplier, we all have licenses. We might post collateral to the states depending on their rules. We have to demonstrate with each utilities that we can communicate via EDI for all of the transactions. For an example, those transactions are enrollments of customers, drops of customers, rate changes, receipt of the billing usage data so that we can turn around and send a transaction back to the utility, so that in a UCB instance, the utility can actually place the supplier charges on the bill. I've covered the process for enrollments and drops, which are typically tariff-based rules that the various public service commissions have developed in conjunction with the utilities. And then finally, they all have to reconcile what they're receiving from the utility to make sure it lines up with what suppliers are expected to receive from a revenue perspective. And then at the bottom, I mentioned the PSC requirements for licensing, complying with RPS if the state has it, and obviously there's annual reports and stuff as well. I would say before we move on real quick, some of these functions can be outsourced. So I don't want you to think that there is no help to be gotten on these activities. But the thing I think that's key to remember is that LSEs are ultimately responsible. Whether they outsource those activities or not, the financial and operational risk really reside with them. And so if a CCA is an LSE, it ultimately resides with the CCA. Next slide, please. What we thought would be kind of instructive at this point is to kind of go through what the characteristics of a CCA are with a retail supplier providing the LSE services. And then at the end, we'll show some of the characteristics of a CCA as the LSE. But generally on this slide, what we've tried to portray is how a aggregation program kind of launches, how a CCA would launch. And this is based on our experience, mainly in the Eastern markets across the most mature states with CCA programs. But typically the process starts with a community hiring a consultant up front to help them develop their program that they want to see implemented. And when the retail supplier is serving as the LSE, at some point in the process, they will select a licensed retail supplier to actually serve all the residents and the small commercial customers. So in essence, while the CCA sort of acts as a licensing authority in my term for developing a price, the end-use customers actually ends up being a retail customer of a particular supplier. The real work, I think, in my experience, is that developing the RFP is really done between the, in this case, would be the county and their consultant, and then we'll call you anyway. So I'm sorry, did we have a problem?
We lost you for a second. You kind of timed out, so I think we missed the last thing that you said.
Okay, well, what I was saying was one of the things I wanted to talk about, just as an aside for the county, is that when the supplier serves as the LSE, and the supplier will typically have a call center, we'll have all of the infrastructure in place, right, to handle all of the customer service issues. Some customers will still call the county about issues, and then the county. So it's important for the county to not think that, or any CCA to think that they really just get to wash their hands of everything. Largely that is true, but there are oftentimes we'll be dealing as a supplier back with a city or a county because the city has gotten a call from a resident with questions. So that was I think the point perhaps that I was making when we were cut off. One thing that also, as the RFP is developed, typically, what's going to be important for suppliers to know, and and for others to know who might be interested in supplying the CCA, is we need to know what the product is that you're desiring to supply to your residents and small commercial customers. Down to what term. So as an example here, a very typical RFP that I've seen will ask for prices that go from 12, 24 to 36 months. And that's typically the length of an aggregation program. And that's driven by characteristics of the PJM market largely. Plus, I believe in some states, CCAs are limited to 36 months terms. Some of them are, no less than 12, no longer than 36 months before you have to do a new opt-out program. There's just various reasons why it drives. The market standard seems to be contracting on a 12, 24, or 36 month term. One thing I'll say that is different in various parts of the countries is the adoption of voluntary renewable energy above the baseline standard and above the state RPS. I would say in the Midwest markets, what I term the Midwest would be Illinois and Ohio. There's less of an interest in renewable energy as an adder to your CCA program because it will typically increase the price. But people do ask for that, and suppliers are commonly price options up to 100% renewable energy in a CCA product. And in fact, it doesn't, I would say it's not uncommon for a CCA program to have a base rate, which is market-based energy and the state RPS requirement only, and then to have an optional rate that customers can opt into that has greater environmental attributes involved into it. And then when you start talking about voluntary energy, there's lots of different types of renewable energy, which typically in these programs, they at least start, if they want additional environmental attributes, they start with just purchasing additional renewable energy certificates, which can be national wind, it could be more locally sourced wind or solar or other regionally sourced type of products. So it's always important for your RFP to consider all of those options that you might be wanting. Non-commodity value-added products happen at times, but I don't see them. We don't have a great deal of experience in seeing them being very widespread through CCAs. But examples of non-commodity value-added products might be an energy efficiency program that the CCA wants to fund, and then certain suppliers at times will offer, sort of appliance insurance products and things like that. But you don't typically see a lot of those, at least in my experience in CCA programs. Yeah, I highlighted on my own notes to talk about CCA owned generation and CCA PPA coordination. I'm really not aware of any current programs outside of California where the CCA directly contracts for generation. But I am aware of examples where a CCA will have chosen, as an example, a renewable PPA provider that they wish for the retail supplier to contract with. And then, so there's at least 2 examples in Ohio that I'm aware of where a CCA has gone out, selected a renewable energy generation facility, had the electric supplier contract with that generation provider, and then basically incorporate the output of that renewable energy contract into the broader CCA program. I think the reason primarily that that's been the model to this point is because renewable energy developers who are building, new solar, new wind, are looking for PPA offtakes between 10 and 20 years. And very seldom does a CCA itself want to obligate itself directly to that sort of a long-term PPA. And, part of the reasons why the developers like to deal with suppliers as well is because, as I mentioned earlier, CCA program terms are usually only 12 to 36 months. So they need to know, the developers do, that there's a home for their generation with a credit-worthy supplier. And then usually what the supplier will ask for on the other side of that is a contract that's coterminous with that renewable PPA. So there's not a lot of examples right now of that happening, but it is growing. And I will tell you that it is doable because I'm aware of 2 such programs like that are starting soon. Other characteristics, when you're talking about the retail supplier as an LSE, is obviously suppliers have to be qualified financially. We have to be licensed, as we've talked about earlier, and we have to have the experienced staff to handle all of those LSE tasks that we outlined for you earlier. One thing that we haven't touched on a lot in these work groups, but I think is worth noting, is strong privacy and data protection controls. I think that's something that's probably needs to be on the agenda, if it isn't already, for staff and the county's consideration, is that you're dealing with customer data. We'll have to get a file. The supplier somebody will have to get a file from the utility that has the information from the customer, about the customer on it, their account number, their billing address, all of those, their names, all of those various items that are, wrapped up in lots of privacy rules in the various states. So there'll have to be some protocols established for how, who owns that data. Obviously, the end-use customer owns it. The CCA will need it, and the supplier ultimately will need it as well. So that's just something I would throw out for consideration for the group further on. And then also, one of the things that, we're doing is we're beholden as suppliers to provide reporting, whether it be due to a CCA customer or other just regular retail suppliers. Retail customers, we supply annual reports and have to follow all of the laws and regulations of the various states that have competitive markets we operate in. I think that was it for that slide, Judge, if you'd like to advance. This slide kind of tried to talk, what we're trying to do here is show, what happens after a CCA contract is signed. And these are a lot of the activities that typically will take place. I just touched earlier on the basic data requirements, and some of these are data requirements that we've talked about that will be needed even prior to a contract being signed, because suppliers will need to know what load it is they're bidding on before we can even provide a price. But then after the program is launched or the contract is signed, we'll need a different set of data so that we can properly enroll and service those customers. If I look back on our experience here, I think the some of the things that, are just basic, I'll say table stakes that, have to be part of a successful CCA program is that you have to have very simple opt-out processes and methods. Typically, a call center is involved. Oftentimes, a postage paid card is involved that people can send back to opt out. And there's usually also online options where people can either opt out of a program or enroll into a more environmentally friendly product if that's part of the CCA. Live person contact center with toll-free number, are kind of table stakes. Access for multilingual customers. Existing customer contracts have to be protected, meaning that as part of, when we talked a little bit about this in the last meeting about who scrubs the data, typically that's, a couple different entities will need to scrub the data, because what we're trying to look for is to not impact existing customer contracts, because oftentimes in a CCA in a geographic area, you'll have individual residential customers who are signed up on individual plans with other suppliers. Small commercial certainly does that a lot. So there has to be the ability for the CCA to scrub the list, or oftentimes it's the supplier who's asked to do that data scrub, so that we're not enrolling customers who are already in contracts. Another thing that we've touched on here but didn't talk a lot about yet is preserving the ability to continue to participate in budget billing programs. I won't speak to Maryland's rules because I'm not as familiar with them, but in other states, either it's a mixed bag in other states. In Illinois, it doesn't matter if you're a member of a CCA or, the utilities just do all the budget billing on behalf of the supplier, and manage that with the customer. In other states, the utilities might budget bill for the delivery service component, but the supplier has to provide the budget billing number for the energy supply. Like I said, I don't know the specific rules in Maryland or how that will be developed, but those are things that we are used to doing and have to be done. Supplier services agreement and customer terms and conditions is usually something that's worked out as part of the RFP process. And depending on the market, the supplier will oftentimes have a standard contract they're comfortable with, or the community might have a standard contract that they have developed. But components of that are always, it's standardized and usually approved by the PSC. At least the minimum standards are. There's oftentimes a review of the opt-out materials by the regulatory bodies. It's different in each state. That's, I would say in Illinois, there's guidelines, but really those types of materials are determined between the CCA and the supplier. And in other states, those things have to be approved. In Ohio, the opt-out materials are approved each time there's a CCA launched or a rate change. In Massachusetts, the same is true. The opt-out materials are reviewed and approved by the DPU. And in fact, the DPU has a hand in developing standard contracts in Massachusetts. So while I would say the Eastern markets are all fairly consistent, there are differences to consider, and for the staff and the county and the work group to consider is what given what the law allows here, what might need to be done extra. One thing I wanted to highlight is this last few bullets, and I think it really is important to highlight that community involvement and education is the key element in a successful CCA program. And the most successful programs that I've been involved with are doing that community outreach well before a contract is signed. They're doing public involvement meetings. They're talking about what is the goals of the CCA. You know, is it price stability? Is it price savings? Is it enhanced renewable attributes? All of that stuff really needs to, you know, be highlighted by the CCA as to what their goals are, so that when people are presented with their opt-out materials, they know what they're valuing that CCA offer against versus an example, just a price to compare that the utility presents. And like I said, the suppliers will oftentimes be responsible for some of those education materials, but I think a step of education has to take place even before you select a supplier or start your CCA program. Next slide, please. Just a few more slides, and then I'll be quiet. But this is the final slide where CCA characteristics with retail suppliers and LSC. Some current trends that I think we wanted to highlight for the work group is that people choose different structures for their CCAs for different reasons. We are, you know, I would say 10 years ago, it was all about savings to the price to compare. That was the primary determinant in the markets that were active. More recently, and this is I think one of the goals of the counties is they have strong environmental goals they want to incorporate. So whether it be additional voluntary renewable energy certificates you want to purchase as part of this program, you know, that's something that's growing, I would say. It's particularly important in Massachusetts. Almost every program has some additional environmental attributes, even if it's just an optional product. And some examples of these where it can actually get fairly expensive is you know, MA Class 1, New Jersey Class 1, and different hydro specifications. Just to give you sort of a general sense for where the REC market is today, you can buy a national wind REC, you know, typically generated somewhere in Texas or maybe in the Midwest for, you know, $4 to $5 for a national wind REC. A Mass Class 1 REC is $35 a megawatt hour or a REC. So those products vary greatly in price and ultimately will deliver to the CCA a different price depending on what mix of environmental attributes they'd like to include in their program. Another emerging trend is community solar is becoming something that is available to all retail customers in states, including CCAs. I will say there's a challenge in certain states for how the credit they get for being a part of a community solar project is presented to them, and so while that's coming, there's definitely some thought that needs to be put into that for each state. And you know, one of the things I touched on earlier is significant interest has been expressed in how to achieve what we call additionality. And I'll define additionality this way. Additionality is actually going out and procuring power off a new build renewable generation site. So that could be a solar facility in Ohio. It could be a new wind facility. But additionality, you know, in the way I think about it as a term of art, means you're not buying RECs off an existing project. You're actually helping contract for and build a new project. And what I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges with CCAs that are trying to achieve additionality is the length of PPA required to actually do that, and how does that actually fit into a CCA program. Next slide, please, Judge. CCA characteristics when the CCA is the LSC. We talked a lot about all of the day-to-day operational stuff that you have to do. But I think these bullets sort of highlight that you need to have an infrastructure in place if you're going to be the LSC, likely a board to help guide, the direction of the CCA and how those programs are implemented. You have all of those statutory, regulatory, operational, and financial credit risks that you don't have when the supplier is an LSE. Now, make no mistake, I'm not saying that you get them for free, because that's part of what we do as suppliers, is that we do that risk management and handle all of those things. So there's a trade-off there, but for you to consider as which model you try to adopt. You're going to have to perform or outsource a lot of back office functions if the CCA is the LSE. And we went through that list, so I won't belabor it a lot more. But those last two bullets, just kind of highlight some of the basic things that you have to do. Billing, customer service, all of that is basically, your responsibility, or you have to find a partner to do it for you. Next slide, please. Some things we wanted to highlight, and these are directly items out of the California model, where the CCAs are the LSE, is that there has been problems over the past few years, and this is why the momentum has slowed somewhat in California. CCAs have been having trouble, beating the utility price. So when that happens, you get more people to opt out of the program. And if you have procured generation on your own, then you have fewer people to spread those additional and typically higher costs across. So that has led to some financial difficulties for at least two CCAs, and I won't belabor them. You can look them up and look at the history. Another thing that's interesting is that the CCAs in California, I don't know what they did to have as part of their customer education programs, but a survey in 2020 showed that at least only 35% were even aware that they were being switched into a CCA program. So that's something to consider, and kind of highlights the importance of having a good education program for your residents up front. And then when the CCA is the LSE, we've I don't want to belabor this again, but there's lots of more government oversight of what you're doing that is typically borne by the retail supplier and the other markets. And then you have to have staff that's smart if you're going to be the LSE, that can do all of those things with the relevant regional transmission organization and the energy markets. And you have to have people there are people out there that can do that for you, but you really have to have experts on staff to be able to manage all of those activities. And let's see, the last slide that I'll talk to before I turn it back over to Lee is, and for any questions, obviously, we put together sort of a straw man timeline of what we think what will be required for implementing the Montgomery County CCA. Obviously, on the left side of this timeline is where we are today. As we move further to the middle of the timeline, you'll see a box that kind of lists many of the activities that are required by the statute of allowing this pilot program. In 2024, the PSC has to approve the plan. When you get to 4.1, this is when we think you really are starting. Well, you've done a lot of work up to this point to get here, but now you're really starting the commercial side of the CCA by issuing the RFP And, you know, typically, you know, if I get an RFP, my team receives one, we're given anywhere from 2 weeks to 30 days to provide responses. And responses can sometimes come in two ways. You want, you know, technical and financial qualifications and maybe an indicative price at that point. And then, you know, when it's time to execute, you know, and during that period of time, the consultant and the county will probably be evaluating various suppliers or various options they have to launch their CCA, winnowing it down perhaps to a short list. And then maybe, you know, they'll say, on this day, please give me your best and final executable price. And like I said, the timeline, you know, in very mature markets, that RFP issuance through contracting can be as little as 2 weeks. In markets where there's more involved, it can be like 30 days. But basically, I think the thing to illustrate here is that, you know, once you've selected a supplier and they have offered you a price to contract on, you know, the CCA will have to decide that at that time, you know, because power marketers or suppliers or anybody you're going to be talking to aren't going to hold their price for a 2-week period of time. So all of your internal approvals will have to have taken place prior to that so that you're ready to have somebody authorized to sign a contract on that day. So that's just typical of any market, electric market transaction. I just wanted to highlight that. And then once that contract's signed, we think of it as a 60 to 90 day process from when that contract is signed through getting the list of customers to enroll, to scrubbing that list, to running the opt-out period, to receiving all of those answers back. And then finally, depending on the time between when you have to enroll customers, you know, in some markets, we have to enroll customers, you know, 2 weeks ahead of their meter read date, as an example. Seems like it might be a little less time consuming here, but that's to be determined. So anyway, count on 60 to 90 days before power actually flows to anybody, if our timeline is fairly accurate and based on our experience. That's it for me. I've talked a lot, so sorry it's gone a little longer than I anticipated, but hopefully that was instructive. And Lee, I'll turn it over to you and to any questions.
Mark, this is Robbie real fast. Under your May 1st date, you have suppliers. Have you seen any CCAs that have more than one active supplier?
No, I have not. Typically, okay. They are choosing one supplier, and it's just the mechanics of that would be very difficult. You really need one. I think that has been considered in the past, but like I remember Chicago when they did theirs, they considered having multiple suppliers, but no, I've never seen it in practice.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions for Mark? We've gone through a ton of information. Probably needs to sink in a little bit. You know, kind of switching here to the next slide. This is what Mark has presented is really sort of the bulk of what we wanted to convey to you all today. I think what we've put here on the last slide, because there's a little bit of an appendix here after this, but you know, and then some of these things we've raised already in the first few weeks of us meeting, but just other things that sort of, as we look at the Maryland market specifically, that our group at least needs to have some kind of conversation about, we think, is just how do we deal with the net metered customers? How do we make sure we're identifying all the small commercial customers appropriately? I think I've raised on at least one call in the past, you know, there's this Senate Bill 31 that's out there that puts different restrictions on low-income customers and what products they're allowed to take. You know, I don't recall reading in that any exemption or specific allowance for the CCA or vice versa. So I think we probably just need to have that as another discussion item that we think through. Are there implications for low-income customers given that bill? You know, again, I think as Mark just highlighted in his presentation, is there going to be any county-owned generation or storage, which the Act contemplates? If there is, we just need to figure out how that factors in as well. And then, are there any specific billing requirements? I think even on our last call, we started to venture a little bit into their staff highlighted that in some of the billing strawman pieces, particularly around the value added piece. So really, this is just sort of reiterating a few of the sort of flag items that I think, in addition to all the things that Mark talked about of the mechanics of actually getting an RFP out and choosing supplier and working out that timeline, these are just a few of the additional things that we sort of identified as, also need to talk about these things, including the commission's approval process, including, are there any particular consumer protection items that we need to discuss? So not meant to get into, we don't have proposals on these issues today. It's really just more of like throwing some issues on the issue list that the group will need to discuss as we continue to march forward. And I think, Judge, that's probably the last slide for us. We've got here on the end a little bit of an appendix with just some references. We've tried to include a glossary because I know we've been throwing around a lot of energy jargon, and that can be sort of challenging. So I think the last slide might have a glossary on there to help just sort of level set. So if you're wondering what the heck an LSC is or a PLC or whatever, you can reference the deck here as a little bit of a cheat. So I think happy to have discussion about any of this stuff or take more questions, or everybody can let it sink in a little bit, and for future time we can have more conversation about it. But hopefully that was helpful. I think, Mark, you did a great job, so thanks for doing that.
Sure. I see one question in the chat from Lori. Lori, and her question is can you explain how regulated California and deregulated Maryland markets affect CCA implementation? I'm not an expert on California. We do not participate. My company doesn't participate in the California market. California is sort of a pseudo deregulated market, is the way I would describe it, because there were certain customers who got to continue being in a competitive market when California retrenched back when it was a decade or so ago or more. So what I think the answer to the question is, Lori, and I'll open it up to anybody else who might have a better knowledge, but I think the difference is the LSE. The utilities, whenever the state was considering CCAs as being allowed and being able to be carved out from the regulated utility load, I believe the utilities and the state, there was a discussion about it, and I believe that one of the requirements that the utilities said was, hey, if you're going to do this CCA, you're going to have to you're the one who has to take on all of these responsibilities from us. So they actually, as you can see from the list of things, they become pseudo utilities in themselves, is the way to think about it.
Yeah,
that's the primary difference.
And just to chime in a little bit, I mean, I think we have actually, one of our entities, Direct Energy, has participated in some of the California activity more on since the CCA is the actual LLC, it's been more of on the wholesale side and the back office side. Some of that activity has gotten let out, but my understanding, and I'm not a California expert either, since I'm a Maryland person focusing on Maryland, but I do think that the CCAs in California do have some obligations and things they have to meet with the California PUC. So they're not just free agents. They do have obligations that they have to fulfill with the CPUC. The other thing I would say too is, I mean, vis-a-vis deregulated markets, I mean, deregulated is sort of a loaded term from my perspective, because I think, as any supplier worth his salt will tell you, we have plenty of regulations that we have to live by. So there's tons of regulation, right? I mean, in our restructured Maryland market, we've got a pretty fat set of COMARs of things that we need to do and obligations we have to fulfill. So I feel like there are certainly differences to me, the biggest difference is one of the first things that Mark said. It's, who owns the risk, right? So we all have these regulatory obligations that we have to fulfill to a certain level. And then really it comes down to who's owning the risk for the investment that's being made, the buying supply, managing it all. I mean, that really, to me, is the biggest difference between these two markets, because as we said, there's always some obligation to the local governing body. But even with that, I mean, I think one of Mark's slides on California noted, while the CPUC does have some jurisdiction over the CCAs in California, because of the two recent bankruptcies that have happened there, my understanding is that everybody's sort of taking another look and saying, oh, does the CPUC need to have more? Does there need to be more oversight over what the CCAs are doing, just to avoid, some of those problems? So again, that's kind of the extent of my knowledge of California, but hopefully that's helpful.
I see a few hands up in the list.
Yep.
Hoppich?
Yeah. So earlier you mentioned typically the RFPs are for 12, 24, and 36 months, driven by kind of how PJM works. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Is that a function of the capacity market?
Yeah, historically it has been, because suppliers are more comfortable offering prices through the known capacity pricing, which has been, as you all know, historically 36 months, but right now we're at maybe like half that because the delay in the PJM auctions. I will say though that even though that has been the case, we currently in the PJM market are still getting RFPs and pricing RFPs out to 36 months.
So following up on that, is there any reason something couldn't be 18 months?
Nope, there's no reason. 12, 24, and 36 are just very standard terms.
Okay.
But I can tell you we've contracted for as short as 6 months and as long as 60. Actually, as long as 8 years.
All right, thank you.
Mark, it's Fran Francis from AOBA. You referred a couple of times to scrubbing the data, and that it's important to scrub the data so you don't pick up contracts, existing supplier contracts. And I just want, who bears the risk of that? As an example, suppose the customer has a contract and for some reason they get switched where they get penalties from their supplier as well as they're put on a higher rate. Who typically bears that risk?
Good question. So I would say, how do I answer this? I would say typically the supplier bears the risk when that happens. Now, scrubbing the list is a shared responsibility, but ultimately the supplier is the only one who can make that right, because they're the ones who can reinstate them to the correct supply. And so that's how I would answer it. Is typically that's been a supplier issue to deal with.
Okay, and my next question is, we have several members of AOBA who have hundreds, if not more, accounts. What kind of provisions can there be or are there for customers to opt out permanently? In other words, don't pick up my account as my contract comes due. We don't want to use the CCA. We either want to go to Utility SOS or go to another supplier. So what kind of way can existing customers say, we're opting out permanently unless we choose to opt in at some later point?
Yeah, that's probably a good thing for this working group to consider, because I'll just give you an example. I could not permanently opt out a customer in Illinois because
I'm sorry, Mark, I didn't hear you. Could you say that again?
Yeah, I would say I would throw this issue over to the working group to consider, because different states handle it differently.
Okay.
In Illinois, you're required to send a new opt-out notice every time a new program contract is signed. So even if somebody has opted out in the previous contract, they have to opt out again. That's in Illinois, okay? That's a quirk of their laws. Now, on a practical perspective, a supplier can maintain a list of customers if they're directed to by the CCA, that those customers can be placed on a kind of like a do not call list or a do not switch list.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that is something that I know can be done, but a lot of times that's something that's handled contractually between the CCA and the supplier.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Phil also has his hand raised. Do you still have a question, Phil?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Mark, can you, if you know, I'm trying to understand how many of the programs out there have the CCA as the default supply. That's unique to, I don't know if it's unique, but it's a feature of our program where, customers will be swept into it. Now you mentioned two of the CCAs that failed in California, at least one of them, customers didn't know they were on the CCA. So it sounds like maybe they were on a default supply there as well. Do you know?
Yeah. So to answer your question, Phil, to my knowledge today, right, there are no CCAs outside of California that are the default supplier. I will tell you that in Massachusetts, that was a feature in the early days of their market development for CCAs, but they have gone away from that. But I was not involved actively in the reason why that changed, but I do know that at one point in Massachusetts, a customer was automatically enrolled into their aggregation program, but they aren't any longer.
Okay. And the second question I had is, are you aware of any of the other programs where there's more than one rate available to the aggregation customer? So perhaps there is.
There's hundreds of examples. Yeah. So typically, the CCA will contract for the rate that they want, and I'll just use this as an example. They'll contract for Montgomery County might contract for what I will call the default rate in the CCA. And don't confuse default service, but what we call as the default rate in the contract, and it might be a rate that includes traditional generation supply mix plus the state RPS requirement. Okay, that's the rate everybody's going to get enrolled to automatically, and then they might have an optional rate that has all of the same characteristics plus 100% renewable energy backed by national wind tracks, right? And that'll be at a higher price. They would not, if somebody in the opt-out process can tell the supplier up front, hey, I want the greener rate. I want the greater environmental attributes to be supplied to me. Typically, they can either do that during the opt-out period. They can opt into that higher rate, if you will, or they can. Most programs allow them to make that choice during the term of the agreement. So there's two or three rates. In Massachusetts, it's not uncommon for there to be as many as 3 different choices. And sometimes the default rate that a community might choose is not the cheapest. They may say, I want my default rate to be mass, 10% additional mass class 1. So it's just basically the contract shows 3 rates. You identify which one is the default rate, and then any other of the rates people have to choose by contacting the supplier.
So a single supplier is capable of identifying by account number which rate that customer is on, and that's all done on the CCA supplier side.
Yeah, yes. You'll have different rate codes in your billing system that you'll enroll them to. So yes, that's not been an issue to do.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's all I had.
Yep. I see Bill Fields with his hand up.
Mhm.
Yeah, thanks. Bill Fields with OPC. In talking about the 12 and 18 and 24-month terms, is it usual that for with CCAs that at the end of a term like that, 100% of the supply is coming to an end, and the CCA needs to pick up with an entirely new supply after that, or do they have any kind, do they have any kind of laddering that happens with those contracts?
Laddering. I'm not sure I understand your question.
So I think what he's asking, Mark, is, so let's say you get to the end of your 12-month term, and the CCA wants to run the program again. So what happens? Do they rebid it out to put out a new RFP, and then suppliers bid to provide it, and it's just a hard switch on whatever date that happens? Or is there some other mechanism? I think I know the answer to it, but I'll let you answer it.
Yeah, no, they typically, if that happens and they switch suppliers, then there's a coordination effort that takes place in between the suppliers. Honestly, we will be dropping the customers, and the other supplier will be picking them up, and we try to coordinate that activity so there's less confusion, or the least amount of confusion possible. Because remember, that new supplier is going to have done a new opt-out program announcing, here's the new contract rate and everything. But yeah, there's coordination that takes place between the suppliers. But yeah, we as a supplier no longer, if I was the incumbent supplier and I lost the new renewal bid, I no longer have any legal authority to serve those customers. So I have to be sure I drop them appropriately. And make no mistake, things happen where some don't get dropped, and we work all that out. It's not a perfect world, but typically, yeah, we'll be dropping those customers with a meter read date, and the new supplier will be picking them up on the same meter read date.
Yeah. I mean, Bill,
Yeah,
I would also say, Bill, I mean, from my perspective, it's not unlike a customer who's shopping and decides, oh, I want to switch from supplier A to supplier B. I mean, there's no laddering of that. It's just, you know what I mean? It's just whatever the current offer is from the current market, that's how it's going to be priced.
Yeah, gotcha. All right, thanks.
So, Mark, this is Robbie. So in that case, at the end of the contract term, is there a risk of all these customers coming back to SOS and then going back to another third-party supplier?
Yes. Yes, there is, and I will say that. So I will say this: aggregation programs, once they start, have typically continued. So I think that the mature markets are used to those types of incremental changes. But it is different. I will certainly admit it's different when you have one program versus hundreds in Illinois, right, that are managed in ComEd and Ameren, and hundreds in Ohio. The differences of one large one like the county can be a challenge. But I'll tell you that when those markets all launched in Ohio and Illinois, these were issues that were vetted and talked through at that time. So there is risk that you can come and go, but it's been manageable in the other mature markets, is all I'll say.
All right, thank you.
I see a comment from Stan Edwards about Boston's program last year, which was an opt-out program. I will tell you that almost every program is an opt-out program across the country. There have been a very few that have done opt-in programs. They're just not successful.
I thought that was the question that was asked before about whether they were opt-out or opt-in.
Well, I interpreted the earlier question to be, are there different rates that you could opt into? So,
Well, I think Phil asked a question that I think Stan's referring to about it being default service, which I do think is a distinction. That is a very fine distinction, because in these other programs, the utility standard offer service or default service, whatever they call it in the other states, that's still the default.
Not
Right?
in
I think the distinct.
I don't think in Boston.
No, I mean, I think
yes.
that, but Stan, I think the difference here though is the way the Maryland law is written, that it specifically says that the CCA becomes the new default service. So SOS becomes a choice, and that is different than what these other states, including the Boston program, is. I don't think any of the other ones specifically say, oh, you know, a customer has to affirmatively choose SOS, right? I do think that is a little bit of a distinction.
yeah, I agree. Yeah, the Boston program, there aren't any programs in Massachusetts where the CCA any longer is the automatically enrolled into program.
Right.
So the way that would work, as an example, somebody new moves into the city of Boston or into any CCA, right? They establish a new utility account. That utility account is automatically placed on Boston is Eversource, I believe, the utility. They're placed automatically on that utility supply. That person then can opt into the CCA if they wish to, but they're not automatically enrolled to the CCA. If it's a move in, move out situation, or somebody's, that's what I was trying to describe.
Mm-hmm. And that is different than what we have, because the statute clearly says that if you move in, you will automatically go to the CCA unless you choose a supplier or choose SOS. So it's a fine distinction, but that's where it really makes a difference.
Yeah, in my view, this is unique.
Mm-hmm.
This is unique.
So I think we're still working through the new customers coming in, but I think in Boston, when they started their program, the CCA became the default for all the customers.
That's not my understanding, Stan.
Okay.
Abner?
Hey everyone. Hey Mark. I'm Abner Sadik here from Constellation. I serve as a director for our GovAg business. So nice to finally meet you. We compete with each other every day, and I think you did a fantastic job presenting on our industry's behalf. So just going back to Stan's question, we serve Boston currently. I just wanted to provide a little bit of a distinction there. At the onset of the deal, to your point earlier, which was a very good one about communication, Boston set up a specific program to communicate the launching of the program. They set aside a certain amount of dollars. They had web programs, they had TV commercials, they had newspaper articles, etc. And that helped the success of the Boston program at program launch. And that started, call it 6 months to a year prior to the program starting. The point that I wanted to kind of address with Stan's question is, and you're right, you know, there was an opt-out process in the beginning of the program, similar to all the other programs that we have in Massachusetts. Because of it being new, you know, there was a lot of concern around what that initial opt-out percentage of customers would be. But on an ongoing basis, as Leah described, if you're a new customer that moves into the territory, you're not automatically enrolled into the program per se until there's what we deem as like a customer sweep, which is where we get, you know, a list from the utility, Eversource, you were correct in that assumption, and then, you know, basically taking that list, working with the utility, and then enrolling the customers per the opt-out procedures that the DPU put forth for us. So there, to your point, there's a distinction between how I think Maryland is thinking about this automatic ongoing enrollment process, which could be difficult because from an expectation perspective, because you don't know how many customers will join today, tomorrow. Trying to price the attrition aspect of that in a market that goes up and down every day will be a bit difficult. But you know, I'm sure that more details will come out on that process. Again, just wanted to jump in on Boston. Thank you guys. You presented well on behalf of our industry.
Well, Edward, thanks. This is Stan. Can I just ask a clarification there?
Absolutely.
I think I think we're going to have some discussions today and maybe in the next meeting about that process of when someone moves into the county, for example. But I think what I'm hearing you say is, and it's required into the Maryland law under this pilot, that we have this communication with residents that are currently receiving service from their utility, but they are given the option to opt out. But if they don't opt out, they are in the CCA. So that's similar to what you described in Boston, correct?
Well, there's a nuance there because there's an opt-out period that I don't know if you know, we could talk about that offline or not, but effectively a customer in the Boston territory, we have to give them a certain amount of time before they can opt out, before they get enrolled into the program. If you have an ongoing enrollment process, I don't know where that 30 days or 20 days or 45 days, depending on the market, would sit, you know, from providing that customer the ability to opt in or opt out, or I should say hop off of the program or choose not to be a part of it.
But Abner, realistically though, I mean, they're not captured in Boston, right? I mean, a customer could shop at any time. They could decide they want to go back to the utility standard offer service at any time. So even if they miss their opt-out window and they get put into the aggregation, it doesn't prevent them or block them from actually exercising a choice and moving around.
No, not at all.
That's true in Maryland as well, in this pilot as well.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, but you know, to Leah's point, yeah, customer can choose to leave. There's no penalty, nothing, right? Like the issue, not issue, but one thing that we all want to make sure is that the customer education piece of this is really key. We see this in different markets, whether it's a mayor going up for re-election or whatever the case may be in a particular market. Sometimes there's forces that kind of push for challenges with the program based on where the market pricing is, et cetera. So that opt-out procedure that Leah described, a customer can leave at any point without any penalty.
Yeah, it's you know, Mark talked about the different goals that programs might have, and it's interesting working in this program in Montgomery County, and of course we're at the early stages of it. But there are different viewpoints in Montgomery County among county officials. We're very interested in increasing the amount of renewable energy in the supply. But we also have folks in our Office of Consumer Protection, for example, that are very concerned about what this might mean for energy rates. And so that's going to be something they're focused on. So yeah, we have all those tensions within the county.
Yeah, and other
fun
markets face the
conversations,
same
right?
tensions. So again, thanks all. Bye.
Okay, are there any other questions or comments? Thank you so much, Ms. Gibbons and Mr. Fanning. That was an amazing presentation. I really appreciate you taking the time.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
And with that, we're going to move to staff. Bill, do you want to share your screen or do you want me to do it?
Can you allow me to share my screen? I have I think a slight update to the billing or to the enrollment strawman, and then I have another document. Is there a way to do that? I don't, my little share button is not yet active.
Okay, is it active now?
No.
Okay, is it active now?
So it's still grayed out and nothing has changed. I don't know, do I need to refresh something maybe, or?
It says that you're the presenter.
Oh, okay, now it's active. Got it. It took a minute there.
Lag. Okay, it's all yours.
All right, let me see if I can get this properly shared. Okay. All right, can folks see that? All right, now
It's there. You might want to enlarge it a little bit.
actually I pulled up the wrong document. Wait a minute. Let me see if I can correct this. All right, hang on. I seem to have lost the controls when I shared, so the screen I'm looking at is not the one I was trying to share. I need a slightly different document. All right, so hang on one second. This is the first time I had to do this with.
No worries. While you're doing that, folks, if you came on late or for any other reason didn't type in your name and who you're with in the chat box, please do so now. Rather than read out roll, we're going to do it that way this week. And Phil, you should be able to go out of sharing and go back in without a problem if you need that to.
There we go. All right. All right. Let me try that one more time. Let's see if we can get this to work. All right, so can folks see what should be the document that shows the PC54 CCA billing enrollment issue 2.1 red line? Is that what it says at the top of the screen?
It's actually taking a second. There we go. Yes.
Okay, and can you see my mouse moving around on it?
Yes, but it's really, really small. So do you want to maybe put one page up at a time?
Yeah, let's try that. How's that? Is that better?
Gorgeous.
Okay, it's the size of a billboard on my screen in front of me, but it looks like it. All right, so what we've got here is, so we sent around the billing straw man, and I think I'm on the second page, here we go, last week. And so we had some opportunity to discuss this with a couple of the stakeholders. And so there are some minor changes. You'll see that in there's some red text here. That's a change, but the sort of brown or goldish color highlights that you see, that's the same thing you got last week. So everybody who has one of these is following along on their own document, and that's the same thing. So what this document does is goes over the enrollment straw man, and I'm going to try to get through this quickly. It sometimes can take close to an hour to walk all the way through, but we're going to try to accelerate that because we also have to get back to the billing straw man and try to quickly address a couple of the changes that folks had sent back in the feedback from I think the 9th. So last week there was feedback. So let me try to get through this. We'll probably want to reserve a little bit of time at the end of the call to go back over that. And then what we're going to try to do is revise the billing straw man with any changes we need to make. And then also probably with the expectation for the March 1 meeting, we're going to lock that down and maybe lock down the enrollment if that's possible. So I'm going to try to get through this in maybe about 45 minutes or faster if we can. Folks will certainly have the opportunity to respond to this in writing. As you can see up here, we're looking for comments on this one by next, I forget if that's Tuesday or Wednesday, but the 23rd next week is when we're looking to, I think it's Wednesday, to get this squared away. All right, so, and I can't see hands being raised, so Judge Grace, if you would let me know if someone has a question as we go through, or folks can just chime in, that would work fine for me as well. So what we've got here, so we're going to talk about the enrollment, the initial process first, and then the second page talks about the enrollment that will occur once the CCA is set up. So I think everybody knows we're looking at possibly 200,000 accounts, and we want to enroll those accounts through the a standard EDI enrollment process, so without having to make significant changes. There are two key elements, and I thought the timeline that we had in the earlier presentation was helpful because it sort of showed this graphically. So we're going to probably try to steal that. There are two different places or time periods when the CCA needs to provide a notice to the electric customers in Montgomery County. And one of those will occur under what's directed in 7-510.3D. And then the other is addressed, I think, in 7-5.10F. The distinction is one's a notification that there will be a CCA and that it's going to go into effect on a particular point. The other is going to be a notification that goes along with the opt-in, opt-out selection process. So we are thinking that the utility, so Pepco and BG&E and Potomac Edison individually will need to be providing a list of all the accounts that they have of electric customers in Montgomery County. And they may need to do that as early as November 1st of 2023 in order to provide that notice 60 days before the initiation of the CCA. So there will need some communication between the CCA and the utilities at that point, but there's a requirement to send that notification prior to the initiation of the CCA, which if you read the law, you're thinking that can't happen prior to January of 2024. So about 60 days in advance of that, there's going to need to be a notice that the CCA has to go out to all of the mailing addresses or whatever the other contact is. And then the red highlight you see down here, it was kind of pointed out to us. The notice may have to go out 60 days prior to the startup of the CCA or the initiation of the CCA, which is triggered by filing with the commission. That means, of course, that the CCA is going to need that list of names and addresses and possibly emails at some point before that. So that could be actually, maybe a month or two before that. I think there's a desire to make sure that the list is as accurate as possible. So to the extent it's changing over time, the closer you can get to when the list is actually going to be used is probably better. So the utility and the CCA, probably have to work out the technical details on when you want that provided. But as early as a year before, or close to a year before the CCA is going to start up, they'll need that from each utility. All right.
Bill, can I ask a question? It's Fran.
Yep.
I apologize because I had to miss the last meeting, but is the idea that at this point, they are only sending the, giving the letters, for example, to where the electric company sends the bill? So for example, if there's a management company that manages 50 different properties, is this management company going to get 50 different letters for all of these companies based on the address? How is that going to work? And I'm only talking about, my questions will only be going to the small commercial customers, not the residential.
So, we haven't thought of that far in advance yet. The law seems to indicate that it goes to each electric customer. So if there's a practical way to manage that for multiple accounts associated with a single address, we should work that out.
Okay, one last question that we'll need to think about. Usually the customer, frequently it is for small commercial, it has to do with the owner of the property. However, bills sometimes, as they change management company, the billing address gets changed, but the account number doesn't get changed because it is still with the same owner. I'm looking to ensure that nobody gets picked up into the CCA when something like that happens if they don't choose to. So it's a change of address, not a change of account number of where the bill is sent. So we need to deal with that at some point.
Yeah, we have not sort of tried to delve into the difficulty of making that communication effective, but there may be some differences for non-residential versus residential accounts. So any thoughts you have on that, please let us know. And I think we probably don't have to work that out just yet. That's more of a, we need to have the utilities prepared to produce some type of file or communication where they can send all this at once.
I think it would be helpful as we're drafting rules or getting on that we talk about residential and small commercial differently, because they are very different types of service and will have different needs when we're getting into more specifics.
Yeah, I would agree with that. To the extent you have a suggested way to sort of manage that with your knowledge of how the accounts for your clients are laid out, let us know. We'll try and work that in, right. Might as well begin talking about that now if possible.
Okay, thanks, Phil.
Yep. All right, any other questions before we slide on here? All right, hearing none. So I think we may be thinking that if the notice goes out November 1, 30 days ahead of that might be reasonable. That gets us very close to when the, you know, and the most accurate list, and then plenty of time to sort of manage that. All right, so the second notice that we're thinking about here is the one required by 7-5.510.3F. And this one's going to have additional information, terms and conditions, that sorts of things. And that is probably the list that will be telling the customer, you have the option to opt out of this. If you don't opt out, you're going to end up with the CCA. If you have a retail choice contract, you won't be switched unless you tell us you want to be switched, and that sort of thing. So we're anticipating that if the CCA is starting up October 1, that that notice might have to go out, possibly August 1st. Again, these dates are pretty flexible at this point. We're just sort of thinking about, a general picture of how long it would take. Since the list is going out on October 1, if it does, conceivably there are some switches that would occur, changes that would occur in the customer if they enroll in a retail choice or if they drop to SOS in between August 1 and when that CCA start dates occur. So we'll talk a little bit later about like what we need to do to sort of anticipate that. Was there a question?
Phil?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Leah. Just a quick question. On the second notice that was the top of that bullet's a little bit obscured, but the second notice that goes out, which is the actual opt-out notice. I mean, in my mind, that one does not go to customers who are shopping with a supplier, right? Because they're not supposed to be impacted. So the first notice that sort of tells everybody about the CCA and tells everybody when it's going to start, and it's like a little bit more of an informational, educational type of tenor to it, that goes to everybody. But the one that you're actually asking customers to opt out would not go to customers who've shopped. That's at least how we've read the legislation.
So we can certainly take a look at the words there and decide how that's going to go. But if it says in the law that it goes to all electric customers and doesn't distinguish the ones that have switched or not, that notice with the terms and conditions might still have to go to even customers that do have a retail contract. If a customer who has a retail contract doesn't receive notice of that, they won't know if that's something that they want to actually opt into. So part of that notice would allow that customer to say, well, hey, I do have a retail choice contract, but maybe that's ending soon, or maybe I can drop that contract without a penalty because I know that, and I do want the CCA. So there's probably something that says, I'm asking you to put me on that. I do have a retail choice contract, so I'm giving you my permission to enroll me anyway. And that might be something that would be done with that notice. And we can certainly talk about whether or not that's the right or wrong thing to do. And we're very interested in knowing what the retail choice community has to say about that. But I think when we read the language there, we anticipated that communication would also need to go to all electric customers. But we can certainly take another look if there's a concern there.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, if you're actually sending the opt-out notice, and I mean, Mark or Abner or anybody who's like actually dealing on the business side with processing those opt-out notices. I mean, the whole point is if we don't hear from you, we're switching you. So if you're on the list that got a notice, but you didn't respond, then you're going to get switched. I guess that's really more of the concern that I'm sort of flagging, is that you don't want, because if I'm a shopping customer, which I am, and I get this notice and I do nothing, nothing should happen to me, right? But if you're on, it's more of like, how do you manage, how does the supplier who's selected to, assuming that's what we do, how does the supplier that's selected manage those lists if you've got them sort of commingled? I guess that's really my main point, because really they're going to be kind of taking tabs on who's opted out, and then anybody who didn't opt out is going to automatically get swept in. I think that's just the concern, is just, aside from also creating confusion for shoppers,
Right.
and, potentially setting them up to abrogate contracts that they didn't mean to abrogate and potentially incur exit fees and stuff like that, or switching fees. I think that's really the flag I'm raising, is to make sure we're not creating confusion.
Yeah. I understand that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the mechanics of this of the switching that happens like in between the first list and then the post startup switching. And we're going to get a little bit more into some detail that might help to clarify how that would work so we avoid the problem you talked about. But conceivably, when we look at how we design this communication, if it says, if you do nothing and you're on SOS, you're going to be switched. If you do nothing but you're on retail choice contract, we're not going to affect that contract. If you want to switch to the CCA and you're on a contract, you need to tell us. So I would imagine we will have to make sure the communication is clear enough to give the customer the information they need to act appropriately in response to that list.
Yeah.
So, but I think
that's fair enough. Fair enough. I think that's fine. I mean, I guess, I'm just sort of pointing back to one of the points that Mark made in his deck about just keeping it really, the opt-out piece needs to be really simple so that people don't get confused. So.
Right. And we'll have to think carefully about like the processes that sort of make the, things happen the way we expect them. All right. So if that notification goes out on August 1st, there will obviously need to be some time period in advance of that when the information is provided. But again, that second batch of data that goes from the utility to the CCA or whoever's handling the enrollment for the CCA is going to need to have more than just mailing address now. It'd be name, account number, information needed to switch the customer or to enroll the customer. And also, that's probably where you're going to see information. Is this customer on SOS or is this customer on a retail choice contract or other types of information that would have to be in there? So kind of moving a little bit further down, we've already had this particular bulletin here where it sort of addresses that the CCA is going to scrub that list. And by scrubbing, they're going to take in information that comes from the utility, telling them which accounts have a retail choice contract. The expectation would be, without anything else coming from the customer, those retail choice contracts would not be sent an enrollment. And we'll talk about mechanics later. There's possibly a way the utility will simply block enrollments that come in, which is not to say that the CCA would be encouraged to just enroll all of the accounts. Again, that's a technical detail we can sort out. And then based on the response to the opt-out, there's expected to be some customers that will do nothing, and then the default kind of behavior will occur, and that's just an enrollment. If there are customers that act to say, yes, I want this, and maybe that's because they're on retail choice, or there may be customers that are given a choice in that letter to select sort of the I won't say default, I'll say like the regular CCA service, but maybe they'll also offer a greener version. Maybe the customers will be selecting those, amongst more than one option that they have from the CCA. So that doesn't necessarily affect the enrollment per se, but to the extent that the CCA is getting all that information, they're going to scrub that list. The responsibility of making that accurate, the way we're sort of describing this here, that's on the CCA or the supplier that's handling that for them. So the utility is going to provide a list with the information that's required, and they're going to accept enrollments according to the rules we establish. But I think what we're envisioning here is that the CCA will have the responsibility to make sure that they correctly enroll the accounts they're supposed to. All right. Moving down a little bit further, I think we talked earlier about there being a limit to the number of enrollments that occur on a daily basis. I think we're looking at 10,000 accounts on a per day. We're probably going to want to refine that a little bit further once we start thinking about how those are transmitted. So the folks who are familiar with how enrollments come in using the EDI transactions can probably give us some more information about what that's going to look like. We have the expectation, and we talked about all this stuff before, that this could possibly take 20 days for PEPCO, and it'll be faster for BG&E and PE if they're using the same amount per day. But possibly that can be something that can be mutually agreed upon by the CCA and each utility to work that out. The new stuff down here is we understand that there's going to be a need to manage any changes that occur to the customer account between when the list is provided, which is at some point earlier than August, and then when the default enrollment process is going to begin in October. So the first bullet here, enrollments of a retail supplier account. Now, I'm not saying that the utility or the CCA would ever be sending a retail supply account and enrollment. But if a customer switches to a retail account in between when that list went, the CCA might not know that that's the case. So if they enroll a customer that has now switched to retail in between when the notice went out in October 1 of 24, the utility should reject that. And that might be with a code that goes back to the CCA saying, hey, this customer has switched to retail choice between now and then. So we're rejecting this enrollment because they're a retail choice customer. If a customer opts out of the CCA service by contacting the CCA or the utility. Now, and you're saying, well, why would they contact the utility? Well, the law indicates that they can contact the utility or they can contact the CCA for opting out. So that might mean you have a situation where if they're contacting the CCA, maybe it's because they return their postcard or they make an entry on a website or they call up and then they tell the CCA, I want to keep SOS, or they shouldn't have to tell them they want to keep their retail supply. But conceivably, the utility needs to be able to field requests for that, and so we'll need to work kind of that approach out to the extent that the utility is taking phone calls or something, or how if they put something on their website to allow for this, quite possibly the utility will have to develop a means to reject a enrollment with perhaps a different reason code than the one for retail accounts that get enrolled inadvertently, and possibly some approach to being able to flag those and return a response to the CCA saying, here's why we enrolled that, and maybe that allows the CCA to then update a list, or as Fran was mentioning, if there's some way to sort of permanently exclude that, maybe that's a flag that can be set on the account. Now, I'm sort of talking without having an understanding of how the utility systems work for this, and it's certainly been some time since I've had to deal with this. So we're trying to describe here what the performance of the system would look like and how it would function. And if there's technical issues with that, I certainly would need to hear about that from the utility folks when you either now or when you've responded next week. All right, I will move on to the next page. At the very top of this, I think I sort of already talked about this a little bit. This, in the instance where there is a retail account that wants the CCA service, and they have responded back to the CCA saying, I would like to be on the CCA. There needs to be something perhaps in that enrollment that would tell the utility that, yes, we know this is a customer with retail choice and they have given us authorization to enroll them. So do not reject this. Maybe that's something that is a matter of setting a code that can be reacted to, or maybe that has to be dealt with kind of outside the process through some type of a workaround. That's kind of how we're sort of thinking about this, very preliminarily. All right, so that's the general discussion of how the enrollment process will work prior to or at the onset of the CCA startup. Are there any questions about that? And if not, we will move to the discussion of what happens after startup and on a continuous basis during the course of the pilot. Okay, no questions? All right. So as a concept here, this is a lot more technically involved, and there's a couple of different options. So I think what I'm going to present here first is more of a description of how we would like this to function, and based more on just a comparison or a mirroring of the treatment of default service for the CCA in the same way it works for SOS. So we are not, and a little further down, there are a couple of alternatives that do not provide this level of functionality and don't quite mirror things. And we understand that there are some perhaps objections as to whether or not some of those alternatives actually comply with what the law says. But we are sort of offering first that as a way to start examining how this will work is if everyone understands that there is a requirement that the CCA becomes default service, let's attempt to describe the function we're looking for as something that mirrors the way SOS is assigned to a customer's account under any number of, actually there's 5 that we've come up with, 5 different scenarios where a customer enrolls in new service or otherwise transfers service to a new location and needs to be put on whatever the default service is. So feel free to ask questions as we go through, but let me just try and walk through this first initial expectation, which is not attempting to address technical issues with making this functionality work. So we understand there may be some difficulty there. All right, so the 5, let's see if I can get them all on the screen here. So before I dive into that, the initial discussion here is we want to develop a process for assigning the CCA the same way SOS is assigned. So that means that when a customer moves in or when they take service at a new location, they will be assigned without any action on the part of the CCA or on the part of the customer. They will be assigned to the CCA as the default service. And they wouldn't, they wouldn't go to SOS at that point. All right, and then I think we had this, we are not having any expectation that there's limits to the number of transactions that occur on an ongoing basis after the CCA is set up. All right, so let me see if I can get all 5 of the sources of this issue. I think, yeah, that's most of them. All right, so we've got a situation where we've got to move into a new location. We're thinking about a transfer that is kind of like a seamless move. We're thinking of a drop from the SOS or a request for the CCA, which might be no distinction between those two. You might think of a situation where a customer is dropping their retail choice account the same way they would drop to SOS now. And then whether or not this actually is a realistic expectation, but the law sort of talks about it. If there's a drop at the end of a contract that doesn't involve the customer just going onto a variable rate, for example, how would that be assigned to the CCA? So the first one is that when the customer is moving into a new residence or in the course of a non-residential customer, new business location, that they call the utility or however they normally contact the utility to initiate service. And that may occur as soon as the day they arrive or whatever the utility typically permits. So the utility allows you to move into an apartment to call them when you're halfway through getting the living room installed and say, hey, I just moved in. I'd like to take responsibility for the bill. If that's what is permitted by the utility, and notice in advance that that's not required, I think what we're trying to express here is that the customer would be assigned to the CCA at the time that they initiate service, and it doesn't require a delay and doesn't require the CCA to otherwise take an action to cause an enrollment to process in order to make that happen. All right, so that is a scenario that I think is what happens exactly with SOS at the moment, and so I think what we're looking for is a way to design a function that would work exactly the same way for the CCA. There is a thought that there might be, and I don't know if this is done right now when a customer signs up. I don't know if any of the 3 utilities that are impacted will typically tell a customer, okay, great, welcome to our service territory. We're putting you on SOS. We are a choice market. If you want to find out about retail choice offers, go to this website or call this phone number. I don't know if that happens right now. To the extent that it does, it would probably be entirely reasonable for the customer to be informed of all of those options, including including SOS, and possibly, the other non-automatic CCA options, if that's the case, at the same time. But again, that's not necessarily something we envision where they would have an option to select those when they initiate service, but they would be sort of sent to whatever communication is appropriate for selecting a new supply offer, if that's what's done right now.
Bill, just another wrinkle that I want to throw in that I
Okay.
can talk to you another time about. But I know right now Pepco has a program which is used by many of my members who own master metered apartments, or a combination of master metered and individually metered apartments. When a tenant moves out, the customer the building manager or owner has the account automatically put onto his supplier contract. And they do that, it's an automatic switch. And they do that so that they're able to get into the apartment, clean it, upgrade it, paint it, do whatever needs to be done. And then it is changed over again when a new tenant moves in. So what my members would like would be automatically when a tenant moves out and disconnects service, that program where they're automatically switched into the manager or the owner of the building's name, that program be allowed to continue and they're not switched back into the CCA, unless of course they choose to go or at another time opt out. It's a very popular program that works well, and I would really like not to see it disrupted.
Okay, I am not familiar with that, but let's keep that as something we need to take a look at, and figure out, how that can work.
What it saves is, in the past, the manager of the apartment would have to go down to the utility office. They would lose a few days between the customer move out and when they could connect service into their name. And it would be a delay. It was time consuming for Pepco as well as my members. And right now it's automated and it works well.
So there is a way to automatically, it's almost like Instant Connect, where you have a preset automatic enrollment that will occur, but it doesn't involve an enrollment. It just involves.
No, it goes onto the owner's supplier contract, because mostly my members have supplier contracts. It automatically goes onto their contract.
That, quite possibly if that functionality already exists, maybe that's one of the ways we can do some of these things. But okay, so when I've made a note of it already, but definitely put that in whatever detail.
You and I can talk offline at another time.
That's fine. We'll want to make sure that we don't interfere with something that's already working well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Phil, this is Robbie. For us, it's the landlord-tenant agreement, and those accounts are coded. So we know exactly which accounts are affected by the agreement.
Okay, that's helpful. I would love to understand a little bit more about that. So maybe we'll pick that up at some point.
Okay, Robbie, thank you.
All right.
You're very welcome.
So the rest of these, and I'll try to get through quickly because I know we're sort of now running out a little bit of time. Transferring to a new premise. So I think we're thinking this looks a lot like what Seamless Move will be doing once that becomes effective, and Seamless Move, by the time the CCA starts up, I think will have been in place in Maryland for 18 months or so, maybe a bit longer. So I think what we're suggesting here is that the customer is they're not going to be switched to something different if they've already selected something at their Seamless Move location, but that could be the CCA, SOS, or retail choice. So the assumption there is that if a customer post startup has previously stayed on SOS, they would have done so by making an affirmative selection. I guess we're not expecting them to have to make that affirmative selection again when they switched or when they move, if they do a Seamless Move within the Pepco territory. If they are switched, or if they're making a Seamless Move from outside of Montgomery County, say from Prince George's County into Montgomery County. I think that might look a lot like a move-in for the purpose of seamless moves, because they would not have had the opportunity to opt out. But that might be a finer point that we can talk about. But just generally, seamless moves would stay seamless and not change the as a result of the CCA situation. And then the last two, or the second to last two here, dropping from SOS or dropping from retail choice. So probably someone doesn't call up and say, drop me from SOS, because they wouldn't normally have the expectation, or possibly once the CCA is running, they may have known that they selected SOS at some point and they want to drop from it. But what they're effectively doing is requesting the CCA. So in the same way that the utility is able to take a customer that's on a retail choice contract, and if for example, and I think the rule, we'll just review this a little bit so I make sure I have this right. If a customer wants to drop the retail choice contract, they're supposed to call the retail supplier. In the event that they've attempted to do that and they're unable to reach that supplier, the switch is not effective, they can go and call the utility. So that's kind of one situation for the retail choice contracts where they would be dropped to the CCA there and not to SOS. Again, with the option perhaps to be directed to a site that would give them, or a phone number that would give them their choices of retail contracts or SOS to select going forward. And then if somebody calls up and calls the utility and requests the CCA, conceivably that's either the utility will treat that like the way they would treat a drop to SOS, or potentially, if that's not the best way to do it, maybe that's where the utility has to tell the customer to contact the CCA to get an enrollment. So there might be some permutations in there, but I think just the general game plan here is whatever the utility does for SOS right now, CCA is the default role of replacing standard offer service after the CCA starts. So the functionality we're attempting to do is to closely mirror what happens with SOS under the current system. And then the last one here is, if there's an automatic drop from the end of the contract, that would fall to the CCA. And that's, I think, exactly what it says to do within the law. All right. So if there's questions about this, we should probably stay on this for a second. If not, I'll go to talk about some of the alternatives that we have also suggested.
Hey, Phil, this is Bev Sikora. And I don't know how likely this is in Montgomery County, but say there was a new house built or a new business, a new actual structure, would that fall, I'm assuming, under the first one?
Yeah, I think that looks like a move-in, the way we're thinking of it, where, at some point, the customer is probably initiating service, not by calling up and saying I moved in, but by making application for service to get the service connection installed. So maybe that's a slightly different process, but there you might have a little more opportunity for the customer to be informed that we're gonna construct this, sign the papers, pay the fee, whatever process you do now to tell the customer they're going to get SOS, you would do the same thing.
Right.
That's the general concept there.
Gotcha. And just, right now we don't really, well, I guess we have, I don't really know what we do, but because we don't have instant connect, really the customer on day one has no choice but to be on SOS. You're not precluding, though, that if say, especially in the case of that new, a brand new premise, where there's more time and that, if the customer, say, came in and said, hey, my building is going to be, ready, I'm going to start up and start service on whatever day, and from day one I have a retail supplier that I want to go with, you're not precluding that. It's just, I guess, that if they don't make another option, they would default to the CCA.
Yeah, I don't know that we've thought about how to to sort of build Instant Connect specifically, separate from this concept. A little bit further down in like one of the, I think it's alternative 2, that's kind of like, let's just do this by building Instant Connect, but it doesn't work the same way from my understanding of how Instant Connect has been proposed previously. It doesn't work the same as the way SOS is assigned at the moment. So I don't think, are any utilities allowing a customer to say, hey, I'm building a house here and there's no service until I walk in and turn it on? Can anyone get assigned a retail choice contract that way? Doesn't that still require like a pending account? Or does it? Or, I mean, I'm not aware that customers.
You are correct. Correct. It needs
So-
the active meter.
Okay. So, at some point, if Instant Connect is built, then that'll exist and then customers can do that. I don't know that that might be a side effect if this functionality is built and then it's found to be able to be used, to do Instant Connect one way or the other. That's not our mandate here, but it certainly presents some options that, folks might want to, the folks who are kind of focused on retail choice enhancements, and that's probably Joey Chen's working group, but it's an option. Let me just in interest of time, let me roll down here to this last page and go over the. I don't think I can get them all. Well, I can get most of it. All right, so there's 2 different alternate options that we thought about. The reason they're alternates here and not staff's not trying to tell you which one you should pick, but these don't quite perhaps treat the CCA the same way SOS is, but they may, based on our limited understanding of how some of these things work, they may actually present a solution that's possibly more technically feasible based on what we understand about what might need to happen in order to make the first option work. So just generally, developing Instant Connect would be one particular approach to doing this. I think the major distinction is that Instant Connect is probably, if I understand how this has been proposed previously, it doesn't work the same day. It does require a certain amount of notice, and that is to establish sort of a pending account, not in a location that may already have an active account, but then it would allow an enrollment to be made to the pending account that then becomes active at some point. So without trying to get completely into the development of that process, there would need to be some significant changes perhaps to the way enrollment works under the retail choice model. Whether or not this then becomes available for the rest of retail choice is perhaps another discussion. But you would need to, if the customer is providing notice, now let's say that's only a 1-day notice, say I'm moving here tomorrow, the CCA needs to find out that the customer is moving in. So that's either the utility saying, hey CCA, tomorrow there's going to be a new customer at this particular premise. You need to send us an enrollment so that we can, on startup, have them as your customer. That's one thing that could happen. It could also be that the customer is told by the utility, if you want to have the CCA on day 1, you need to go tell them, which doesn't sound a lot like default, but that's a potential workaround if something else isn't possible. So the second bullet there, this allows an enrollment using the standard approach to EDI, perhaps, if I've correctly described that. But it allows a new feature which doesn't exist to my understanding, which says you can enroll to a non-active account number or a pending account number. And the issue there in the 3rd bullet down there, I'm sorry about the numbering, that might be a situation where there's a delay, and I don't know if that's just 1 day or if that's multiple days delay. It sort of depends on how fast the CCA becomes aware and then can turn around and send an effective enrollment. So I think enrollments are still a couple of days, but maybe that's changed or that can be improved. So that sort of is just saying there's a little bit of a delay. Sounds like you might be on SOS for a day or 2. The downside of being on SOS for a day or two is now you're going to probably see SOS on the bill for a couple of kilowatt hours on that first bill, and maybe that's problematic for the customer or confusing for them. So one of the little bullets down here at the bottom is possibly if this is, you know, the cheapest or the optimal workable situation for sort of making the CCA default enrollment occur, maybe there's a backdating that happens as a result of that. That sort of eliminates the bill saying anything other than the CCA, and if that's desirable. So drops from choice and Instant Connect would also sort of, if they're triggering, if a drop from a choice contract or drop from SOS, then it's going to default to the CCA. Sounds like this approach would require the CCA to be notified that the drop's going to occur, and then send an enrollment to time that properly or match up to the switch date, so that you know, comes in on time. And then again, backdating is something that we have to figure out if that's necessary or helpful or not. All right, and then I think I already said this, but you know, possibly if this is Instant Connect the way it was conceived of in other working groups in the past, perhaps, if this is how we do this for the CCA, is there a reason not to make this available, you know, for the rest of the choice market? All right, so that's alternate 2, and it's sort of, it still requires a lot of new stuff to happen and probably a lot of technical work to make it get there. It may possibly be less troublesome to construct, depending, or it may allow for some concurrent development with the existing process that's looking at how to do seamless move. And those are things to kind of figure out going forward. Any other questions on that alternate before I drop into the third one here?
Hey, Phil, this is Rob. I hate to barge in again, but
Oh,
one thing we need to remember also is that not all customers call the call center. Some will use the website to perform the change of address or the mobile app. So we need to think about how that will be incorporated as well to, I guess, expedite those customers.
Yep. That's, yeah, I'm not really having a full grasp of how that's handled and the sort of speed that takes. So
yeah.
So folks can use your mobile app to take service at a new location?
I believe they can, yes.
Wow. Okay.
And of course the website, so.
Right. All right, good. Well, we'll have to, I mean, add some additional opportunities and perhaps some tasks to deal with.
Yeah. All right, thanks.
All right. Yep, thank you. So alternate 3, now this, I think maybe Abner mentioned sweeping going on in the Boston situation. We sort of, I think we may have heard about that as well previously, but we talked to the folks, I think in Ohio, they have, it's not weekly, it's more like a quarterly sweep. And that we were talking to them in the context of how much time that the CCA supplier has to see how many new accounts are coming their way. And thinking of the fact that we've got default service, so it might be that they find out every day how many people are being put on the service. But if we were trying to get very close to the way default service works for SOS, using a concept that is not like instantaneous or on a account by account basis, a sweep over some period. Now we said weekly, but you know, maybe there's a better time period. I don't know if that's longer or shorter. So, you know, throughout the course of a week, maybe starting, maybe Friday ends the work week. So any requests that come in Saturday, Sunday, and then throughout Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of the following week, they get sort of held. The customers move in and they're assigned SOS for that period. And then at the end of that week, there's a communication from the utility to the CCA that says, these are all the accounts that came in. You should enroll them. None of them have done anything, to otherwise tell us, these are the ones that they're not on retail choice. They didn't ask for anything particular. So here's a list of accounts. These 150 accounts came through this week. Go ahead and enroll them. So maybe that takes, maybe the CCA then, gets those enrollments on Friday evening, does whatever processing they do, and then maybe Monday night they send enrollments to the utility under the standard, process. So for move-ins, it just takes like an extra, 10 days or so, maybe a week, to get on the CCA service where you sort of get assigned to SOS first. And if there's going to be drops or from choice or from SOS, maybe those also go into this bucket that get where the list of accounts go to the utility. There's going to be a period of time where you're on SOS during sweep week, if you want to call it that. And then to the extent there are seamless moves that happen more quickly, that they don't go through this process, we would have to make sure we don't interfere with that as well. So that's kind of another approach. I think, when we're looking at how we can comply with the law, this one is the furthest in time from sort of being treated the way default service is treated for SOS. So, whether or not what's being proposed here can comply with that or not, and whether or not folks agree that, I think consideration of this depends on a lot of things, including understanding how much these things are going to cost. So I think what we're trying to do is, based on some conversations we've had and what we've learned at this point, this might represent everything we can think of as to ways to implement the CCA law that gets the default provision for the CCA as close as we can to SOS. And just for a little bit further down here, one last note. So last call, it was sort of suggested that, hey, you do have another work group that's dealing with seamless move. Maybe you want to have that group take a look at how to manage this as well. Staff did reach out to Joey Chen, who is the work leader for that group dealing with the seamless move issue. And so we had some preliminary discussions, but we said, look, we have to find out which of these options kind of looks like it's closest to consensus, and then we will circle back with him. But if there is a consensus from this group, and it makes sense to do some of the development along with the other group because they are working on something that could be similar through the seamless move stuff, we will reach out again and see if the CCMC, that's the right acronym, work group wants to take this on or not. I mean, they want to burden them with that because it is our obligation to get this up and running, but that is an option, but it really depends on how different what we've reached a consensus on. If we don't reach a consensus on these, obviously we have to take a path that gets us a decision on that one way or the other, and so that might put us out of sync with what's going on in that work group. So that that may limit what we can do with them or get some assistance from that group. All right, so that is the end of our suggestions on how to manage this. Are there any questions or comments at the get-go?
Okay, Phil, it's Robbie again.
Yep.
So the weekly sweep. I know we've always been opposed to, or at least PHI has been opposed to providing a customer list for Maryland because we're not required to by the PSC. But if we were able to create some kind of list that identified all the accounts, and we had columns that said this customer is currently with a CCA or a TPS, or this is their start date, would that, because otherwise this is like a manual process for us to do this weekly. So I'm thinking maybe some type of customer list, and then we could put that on the website, and then the CCA can just download it when they need to. Would that be an option?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't. I mean, if there's
I'm just thinking out loud. I mean,
yeah, I think if there's a way to do that, we're talking very generally here. We're not really trying to think through. Now it might be that we can learn like how this. We know that they're doing sweeping in some of the other territories. Maybe we got to find out, maybe call up Eversource and find out how they're doing it. I think
Yeah.
they're doing this in Ohio. Maybe we can talk to some of the utilities there. Like, how are they sweeping this? How are they providing the list to the CCA so they know to enroll? I mean, maybe you build an EDI transaction that sort of does it, or maybe you do some manual process, or you got to build something that works it out. You know, it really kind of depends. I think we're looking for the functionality and not necessarily the how, but you know, probably there is an interest in figuring out ways to do this that are not cost prohibitive.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. Yeah.
This is Fran. So Robbie, what you're talking about, would you be providing the list of customers who are with suppliers? Again, I'm just addressing commercial customers. What's on your list?
Well, we don't have a list. So I'm just thinking what we could put on that list. And there'd be a column that says this customer from Montgomery County currently is with the CCA. There'll be an X in that column for that customer, or if they're with a TPS or on SOS. And then that way I guess the supplier would be able to contact the ones that don't have anything under CCA or TPS. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud as to how we can provide this timely, so that, you know, there's not that much of a lag between a new customer coming on board and being placed on SOS, or, you know,
I guess I'm just thinking of how can we prevent mistakes from happening. And, you know, my feeling would be if you have a customer that is a commercial customer that is with a supplier, perhaps his name shouldn't be on any list, because that would lessen in other words, the ones who opted out once for all time, that name wouldn't be on a list, would lessen the likelihood that there would be errors. And it would be one less thing you would have to provide.
I hear you. Yeah.
I mean, I sort of support that same thing for customers who've shopped and elected a supplier. I mean, why put them on the list?
Yeah, I think that would be best, because it's just lessens the risk, and it also lessens the burden on the utility as well as the customers who've got, you know, it might not be a problem for one store or for one individual building, but for people who have hundreds or thousands of accounts, it would be burdensome to keep opting out.
I hear you. I understand. And then we have those customers also who might not even want to be on the customer list, who want to opt off the customer list. So, I mean, now I'm running down a rabbit hole now, so I'll just stop.
Well, you know, there may be.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm sorry.
I think Bill I see Bill having his hand up, but he's muted.
Yeah, I was. This is Bill Fields with OPC. I guess I'm trying to follow. If we're talking about this weekly sweep, we're talking about the customers who sign up, or maybe they end a sign up for new service, or maybe they end a retail supply contract. They would then be in this group, and they would be. I guess the idea is they would be on SOS for a little bit, and for maybe just a few days, and then they would switch over to the CCA at the end of the week. I guess we have to. One question is whether that has any material impact on SOS. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But a couple. So if you're talking about a list, I thought you'd be talking about the list, that list of customers that the CCA would see coming, as it builds throughout the week, and then you say, here's what's coming at the end of the week. I'm not sure why you would need a list of like everybody. And then the question I had was whether, if you're talking about somebody who goes from supplier to SOS to CCA over the course of just a few days, whether that's going to create any problems with the billing billing for three different suppliers, three different periods there in one, in one billing period, essentially.
Sorry, Bill, can you say that last part again?
Well, if you're talking about somebody who ends a retail supply contract, and
Okay.
if they go to SOS for a few days, and then at the end of the week they get swept over to the CCA, they may have three suppliers in a billing month, and I'm wondering if that's going to cause any problems.
Yeah, I mean, it's entirely possible that you could have, some problems with any number of these. The sweep concept is really just something we are looking at because we're trying to sort of describe what we understand has been done elsewhere. Now, their sweeps were quarterly in Ohio when we talked to their folks. And the benefit to the retailer or the CCA supplier was that they had a while to anticipate how much load was coming through. And I think they did get some kind of information. So they would get a list of customers and they could then, prepare. I don't know if they had to sweep them immediately or there was perhaps a delay. But they weren't dealing with default service here either. I think, looking at this from the get-go, the desire to have it simply mimic or mirror what happens with SOS is probably the best case, which wouldn't involve any of these delays. You'd sign up and you'd be assigned to the CCA service as the same way you get SOS without doing anything. And also, there'd have to be a notification to the CCA that customers moved in and you're now responsible for them. But that wouldn't require a delay to send an enrollment and take all those other actions. So I don't know that we're trying to encourage any of these others. I think we were looking at 2 and 3 as options that might be technically easier, not necessarily present more problems.
Okay, so Phil, so then if we put them on the CCA when they call us, and then we do some kind of reverse enrollment transaction to let the supplier know that they now have this customer, we don't need the sweep, correct?
Yeah, the sweep is only if you couldn't do that.
Okay.
Or the sweep or the instant connect, we're sort of trying to anticipate whether or not you would, if the utility's like, no, we can, if they call us up, we can put them on the CCA that day, and then we'll just send an enrollment response of some kind that says, hey, this person just moved in and you became responsible for them as of yesterday. Or perhaps that happens, same day in some ways. Right. If that I think would be optimal for the purpose of treating the CCA as default service. The sweep was more of a what if if you're saying that it's more likely you can kind of go with that first approach, I'm interested in hearing what everybody else seems to think about that. But that seemed to be the one that was closest to the description of how this was supposed to work from the legislation.
Yeah, the first one seems easier and less risk of an error occurring. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we're advocating for anything other than let's try to make this as close to the way SOS works now as possible.
Right. Okay.
Hey, Phil, David Hobbick has his hand raised.
Yep, David's gonna. Dave, you there?
I am. So on the third option, we didn't note any backdating. So I just was curious if folks had thoughts on a backdating involving a sweep as well, because there is the potential backdating on the instant connect one.
This is Misty from Potomac Edison, and if I can weigh in on that, I just don't love the idea of backdating, period. It involves a lot of unwinding of accounts, and you run into a lot of errors that way. And if we can steer clear of it, I'd really prefer to.
Yeah, and I mean, when you're doing that, you're also, depending on how far you're backdating, you're having to deal with settlements, and that just, I think, very problematic.
Yeah, we were not thinking that we would prefer to have anything that would put SOS as the customer's supply for any period of time unless we had to, because it wasn't practical to assign SOS, the minute you could or the day you could. So if it's possible to make those assignments, the same way SOS gets assigned, where there isn't, and takes that default function the same way SOS, mirroring that closely, that would be probably preferred. So we're very interested in hearing, what would be the best way to make that functionality occur. All right. Well, if there's no other questions on that, if folks would sort of take a look at that, if there are any questions that you have of staff between now and the 23rd, when we're hoping folks can give us some more feedback on that.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah, please do.
This is Misty from Potomac Edison. I just was looking for some clarification on something that you had mentioned earlier. Regarding where was it at? It was the enrollments of retail supplied accounts should be rejected by the utility, that section.
Yes.
I just want to clarify, were you saying that we're looking to block once they're enrolled? Are you saying that we're looking to block in some way the switch over? Or like a lockout once they're involved with the CCA? Or could you just clarify that point for
Yeah,
me,
so
please?
that's in the section where we're talking about sort of the transition on startup when we have the 200,000 accounts or so, and which in PE's case, is like 30,000 or so. So we don't want customers, so we want to comply with the law, and the law does not make the customer deemed to have selected the CCA if they already have a retail choice contract in place. So I think there's maybe a couple ways to prevent that from happening. One of which is to make sure that the CCA scrubs their list properly and doesn't ever send an enrollment for a customer that has a retail choice contract. And they probably can do that if they know that from the beginning when they get the list, say in August of 24, and they can say, all right, well, these are all the customers. We're going to send the notice to them with the information, but we're not, if they don't tell us anything different, we're not going to enroll any of these customers that we can see have retail choice contracts. But if the customer like changes status and they on the list that the utility was provided, the utility provided to the CCA, if they're showing up as an SOS customer, but maybe they just in September signed up with a retail choice, this CCA is not going to know that. So they may send an enrollment for that customer. And I think what we're trying to say is the supplier, or rather the utility, if they get an enrollment for a customer that has a retail choice contract in effect, they're going to reject that enrollment and send a rejection response back to the CCA saying this customer has a retail choice contract. Now, there's the opposite problem, which is where a customer who is present on the list in August that shows a retail choice contract, but then chooses to opt in to the CCA after they receive the notice. And so we don't want those customers to be rejected because they've opted into the CCA. And that is one of the conditions which allows them to have been deemed to have accepted the CCA. So we need something that the CCA can indicate that there's an affirmative selection by the customer and that enrollment should go through even though that customer currently has a retail choice contract. So all of that was sort of thinking what's going on at the time period when that initial list, or sorry, the second list with all of the active customers right before the startup occurs and on the startup day. After that, if a customer's on retail choice, they wouldn't be on retail choice unless they're coming through a seamless move, which I think with the seamless move, would just function according to that existing functionality, and they wouldn't default out of that then. And if a customer's in a new house or a new location, new apartment, they don't have a retail choice contract already. And right now, Instant Connect is not being thought of as something that gets implemented short term. But perhaps if Instant Connect happens between now and then, we'll have to figure something out for that. So that rejection code concept, that was for the startup period in between when the list came and when the startup happens in October of 24.
I appreciate that clarity, because at first read, I thought you were saying block the enrollment of retail suppliers if they're already on the CCA. It just read kind of funny in my mind. So thank you for that clarity.
No. Once they're on the CCA, if they enroll, they're selecting a retail supply. So they would, much in the same way you wouldn't keep SOS if you selected retail choice while you're on SOS.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
I'll try to make sure I make that obvious better in the edits we make. I can't see hands, so if anybody else has a question, just say it. All right. If that's it, so again, please put your thinking caps on and let us know issues or concerns or other things that should be in this discussion for next week on the 23rd. All right. Judge Grace, I have one more thing that we needed to cover, which was the responses we got back from 3 different parties on the billing straw man. And I'll just go over that quickly if I can pull up my. I won't try to project this right now, but just generally, there were 3 areas that folks raised issue with. There were 2 policy areas and then sort of some technical discussions. In general, what we're sort of deriving from the responses is that as far as billing goes for utility consolidated billing and the CCA, provided their, I think the county has told us that they're going to be using the billing kind of methodology, billing system that's the same way a retail supplier does. Whether or not they're actually using a retail supplier to do this, or if they're attempting sort of a build your own approach, which they want to keep that option open. So what we've proposed as the straw man, we're going to make some additional modifications to add some things, but it looks like that's going to go through. There are policy decisions about cost recovery, and we have a list of things that folks have told us they're concerned about relative to cost recovery. And then there's sort of a more specific, when I say cost recovery, it's sort of getting to the cost of making this all happen, the system changes that the utility has to make, et cetera, and the operational cost to, once it's up and running and sort of to test this and make sure it works right. So there's cost recovery, that there's a lot of different sort of who should pay for issues. I think that is something that we can set a time to sort of get that as part of our discussion that doesn't interfere with the technical sort of ideas that we can move forward with now. Implementation of POR for CCA is an area where there's a lot of interest about like what gets recovered in the POR discount rate. Is there a separate POR discount rate for the CCA versus using the same POR rate that Retail Choice uses now? So there's some discussion there. And then the technical issues, I think Montgomery County had this question that they raised specifically. There's a need to possibly be able to bill for something that is not a commodity service. And I think folks understand generally that the way utility consolidated billing works, you're only supposed to be billing for something that's commodity. So there's some additional functions that we have to figure out if the CCA is going to be billing for something that doesn't look like a kilowatt hour charge, because that wouldn't normally be purchased under the POR approach. So we have to sort of address that. I'm not sharing it right now. I do have a document that sort of captures all this, which we'll send out after the call, or I guess maybe tomorrow, to sort of see what we're talking about in as much detail as we can. But with that, is there anything in particular? So like we got responses from the utilities, from Montgomery County, and from the suppliers, I believe. Does anybody need to put their comments up on the screen and maybe talk about something specifically? And if not, then we'll send this sort of little summary out. But generally, what we're hearing is everyone's more or less okay with what's being proposed. There are some policy things about who pays for what that have to get worked out. But we hope to be able then to for sure lock down the billing, just generally what we're going to do with that, and then focus more on getting the enrollment stuff squared away. All right. If anybody has their hand up, I can't see any hands at the moment. So.
Well, this is Lisa. Can I just ask? I don't seem to have gotten the third reply. Did it go to reply? The one from the suppliers, did that go to everyone, or I might have just missed it? Can you resend that, or can whoever sent it to you resend that?
Yeah. Yeah, we should be able to send that out. I think that came from the retail suppliers. Yeah, I assume that what's been sent is shareable. So if it's not, someone should let us know.
It is, Phil, no problem. I think it's probably more an issue of just making sure we have the right distro, but no problem.
Okay. All right. Well, we have to, we made a little kind of short outline trying to summarize all of that stuff.
Okay, that's fine too.
Find the issue. So we'll send both of those out tomorrow.
Thank you.
That's all right. Okay. And I don't see questions. It doesn't look like we have questions in the comments. So I think we are good to go for the next meeting. So we will need sort of feedback on the billing, or rather the enrollment processes for the 23rd, which will sort of get us to the March 1 meeting, where we will probably try to get pretty close to, if not, hopefully we can boil it down to 1 maybe. But if there's a couple of the distinctions about how enrollment's supposed to work, either with the pre or sort of post startup enrollment, we'll try and get to that. Again, we got a lot of mileage, I think last week, after some discussions where we reached out to some of the individuals to sort of try to ask a couple of questions about what they responded to. So staff's really interested in, kind of delving into it. So if anybody has to talk to us or otherwise, we're very happy to kind of spend a little more time with any of the stakeholders that want to do that further. All right, if there are no other questions or comments, I know it's been a pretty long meeting. So Judge Grace, we are, I think, done with our presentation, and unless you have anything further.
Nope, I'm peachy keen. I think we're good to go. Thank you, everyone.
All right, so next meeting is March 1, and we're looking for responses next week on the 23rd. And that's all, folks.
Thank you.
Yep, everybody have a good